We read together just the final 3 verses of chapter 7, but in reality, the whole section from Hebrews chapter 7, verse 26 to the end of chapter 8, it's a full section, and it has a full thought through it. But because it's so big and so dense, I'm going to break it down into 2 or 3, I'm not exactly sure, 2 or 3 sermons. So this morning, we're going to consider part 1 of the superior ministry of Jesus. The superior ministry of Jesus. If I were to write you a cheque for £1 million, what would you do with it? Would you go to the bank? Would you take the time, the energy, and the fuel, and take that cheque to the bank and try to lodge it? Well, I can tell you now that if you drove to the bank to lodge a cheque for £1 million that I might write for you, you wouldn't be 1 penny better off. Not only would you be no better off, you would actually be worse off, because you would have blown money on fuel to take you to the bank to lodge a cheque for £1 million that I would write for you. That cheque would bounce. But imagine if the world's richest person wrote you a cheque for £1 million. Would you take that to the bank? I dare say it'd be well worth your while to take that cheque to the bank. You could take that cheque to the bank because of 2 facts. Because of who the person is, and because of what they have just done. Because that person is wealthy beyond your comprehension, then you know that they can stand behind the cheque. And because of what they have done, because they have written the cheque, then you know that they fully intend that you receive £1 million from their bank account into yours. Who the person is and what they have done, these are the 2 all-important facts. One of the most helpful phrases that I began to hear as I became better acquainted with Reformed biblical teaching was this phrase: the person and work of Christ. The person and work of Christ. The wealth of thought that is contained in those 6 words is absolutely tremendous. The phrase, the person and work of Christ, points us to who Christ is, and to what he has done, and to what he continues to do for us, his people. The last time that we looked at Hebrews together, we considered the very simple fact that Christ is the one who lives. He is the one who lives. And this is true in the totality of his person, in both of his natures. Since he is God the Son, the second person of the Trinity, then he simply is. The name by which God revealed himself to his people through Moses was Yahweh. I am. He simply is the one who is. And then, since Jesus is the one who has been victorious over death in his human nature, since he arose bodily from the dead with the same body that he was crucified, then he lives in the power of an indestructible life. And because Jesus lives, he is able, as our great high priest, to make intercession for those who come to God by him. Now, all of that which we considered, it explains who Jesus is. It explains that he is the one who lives to be our great high priest, as God and man in 2 distinct natures and yet one person forever. But now, as we come to this passage, Hebrews 7:26, right through to the end of chapter 8, the writer comes on now to speak about what Jesus has done and what he continues to do as our great high priest. The writer has spoken about his person, and now he speaks in this passage about his work as our great high priest. And in that whole passage, he lays out 3 things that we can put together into one single thought. And that thought could be worded like this: Jesus is the great high priest that we need, since he has offered a superior sacrifice and serves in a superior tabernacle, mediating a superior covenant. But as I say, because there is so much packed into this passage, I think it's best to spread it over a number of sermons. And so this morning we'll take a look at Christ's offering of the superior sacrifice. Christ's offering of a superior sacrifice. In verse 26, the writer begins this section by spelling out to us exactly what sort of a high priest we need. We need one who is fully qualified in 5 key areas. He must be holy. He must be innocent. He must be unstained. He must be separated from sinners. And he must be exalted above the heavens. He must be holy. The word that's used there, the word that we have translated holy, it's really interesting. It's not the usual Greek word for holiness. It's actually the word that was used by the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament to translate the word which we looked at last Sabbath evening that we found so often in Ruth. It's the word chesed. It's the word that explains and conveys to us God's covenant-loving faithfulness. The high priest that we need is one who displays faithfulness to his covenant obligations. The high priest that we need is one who must be prepared to reflect the chesed, the covenant faithfulness of God. He must be innocent. He must be above suspicion. He must be guiltless. He must be unstained. He must be pure, unspotted. He must be unpolluted by sin. He must be separated from sinners. Aaron and his sons, as they were in the capacity as high priests, they were set apart for sinners. But Aaron and his sons, they were sinners, and so they couldn't be separated from sinners. It was only one who was sinless who could be with sinners but be separated from them in his sinlessness. And finally, the priest that we need has to be one who is exalted above the heavens. He is the one, he has to be one who has the right to the exaltation at the right hand of the Majesty on high. He must have the right to enter heaven. All of these qualifications come together for the purpose outlined in verse 27. And that's found in the words that the writer uses. He must have no need to offer up sacrifices for his own sin before he can offer for the people. You see, a high priest who has sin of his own cannot bring us to God. Only a sinless, only a perfect priest could bring us to God. And the reason for that is this. Only a high priest who can be both offerer and offering can bring us to God. He must be both the one who offers the sacrifice and the sacrifice itself for sin. As evangelicals, we can very easily have a one-sided view of salvation. We can very easily imagine that the only thing needed for us to be redeemed is a sinless sacrifice. Now, it is indisputably true that we do need a sinless sacrifice. But not only do we need a sinless sacrifice, but that sinless sacrifice must be offered by the sacrifice himself. Our salvation requires that the one who is offered in sacrifice, that the one who offers the sacrifice actually be the sacrifice itself. We need a high priest who is able to offer himself as the sacrifice for sins. We need the offering to be at the same time the offerer. And we see this pictured for us in the Old Testament. There's a really interesting statement in the passage that we read together from Numbers 8. In verse 18, God says, I have taken the Levites instead of all the firstborn among the people of Israel. What's the background to this statement? Well, the background to all of this is the requirement that God made after the Exodus that all the firstborn of Israel belonged to him. In reality, when God said all of the firstborn belonged to him, what God was saying was that he demanded the death of every firstborn son or every firstborn animal that was born to the children of Israel. And that's what the last plague was all about in Egypt. The destroyer had the right to the life of every firstborn son. It didn't matter whether they were Egyptian or Israelite. It was only the blood of the Passover lamb that saved the life of anyone that night. And anyone who sheltered beneath that blood that night, but whether they were Israelite or Egyptian, they were spared. But even after the Exodus, that demand for the life of every firstborn was reserved by God. The firstborn of a goat or a donkey, the neck was broken. But the firstborn son, born into an Israelite family, they were redeemed. They were ransomed with the payment of the redemption price. Now, this stipulation was developed further at the foot of Mount Sinai. There was an alteration made. Instead of the payment of a redemption price for the firstborn, God took an entire tribe for himself, the tribe of Levi. And so instead of demanding the death of the firstborn, God put the entire tribe of Levi in the place of all of the firstborn sons of Israel. In essence, the entire tribe of Levi came under the death penalty for all of the firstborn sons of the people of Israel. But instead of carrying out that demand for their death, the tribe of Levi were to function as the priestly tribe. They served as those who were to see to the operation of the tabernacle, and the sons of Aaron the Levite were to function as the priests. But then what about the demand for the death of the firstborn? Was it forgotten? It did happen, but it happened in picture form. Instead of the firstborn sons, the tribe of Levi was put in their place. But instead of the death of the tribe of Levi, the sacrifices were instituted. Instead of the tribe of Levi dying, the priests from that tribe slaughtered sacrificial animals. Let me put it as starkly as I can. The priest took the place of the sinner, but the animal took the place of the priest. We sometimes speak about the Israelites bringing their sacrifices to the altar and witnessing the animal slain. Its blood shed and its body burned. And we often think that the Israelite would have looked on as the priest slew the animal. And we can imagine the Israelites saying, as they looked at the animal, that should have been me. I should be dying for my sins. But what we sometimes miss is the fact that the priest himself, who was slaying the sacrificial animal, he would have been looking on at what his hands were doing and saying, this should be me. I should be dying in the place of this sinner. I am the one who should be dying their death to redeem them, but I can't because I'm a sinner as well, and so my death wouldn't do them any good. The priest was a substitute. He was taken instead of the firstborn of the children of Israel, but he was insufficient. The high priest, the one who officiated at the sin offering on the great day of atonement, he was the one to be the ultimate substitute for the whole nation. But even he was insufficient. Even he couldn't shed his blood for the nation because he needed blood shed for him. He couldn't bring the people to God or bring God to the people because he wasn't what the people needed. He was a sinner. He couldn't approach God except on the basis of the blood of another. A high priest who had to offer for his own sins before he could offer for the sins of the people. He could never be a sufficient sacrifice for sins. And that is why there had to come a great high priest, one who was holy, one who was innocent, one who was unstained, one who is separated from sinners, one who had the right to be exalted to the right hand of God in heaven. Only a high priest like that could be totally sufficient to be the sacrifice for sin itself. But then in the last phrase of verse 27 in chapter 7, the writer simply can't hold back his declaration that Christ is our all-sufficient sacrifice for sin. We need a sinless high priest. We need one who has no need to sacrifice for himself before he can sacrifice for others. And that is exactly the kind of high priest Jesus has proven to be when he accomplished this role for us by offering up himself. And then in verse 28, the writer drives home the stark contrast between the high priesthood of Christ and the high priesthood of Aaron and his sons. He says the law appointed men having weakness as high priests, but the oath appointed a son who has been perfected forever. He's driving home a point that we noticed a few weeks ago. The law, which appointed these high priests with weakness, it didn't make them perfect. The law provided no perfect high priest. All it could do was provide an accurate yet incomplete picture of the great high priest that we need, the great high priest that was to come. But the word of the oath that we looked at from Psalm 110 verse 4, it appointed a son as the great high priest. The son who is declared to us and shown to us in Psalm 2, which we looked at so many months ago. He became the eternal priest of Psalm 110 verse 4. Now, what does the writer mean when he says that this son was perfected forever? We noticed in chapter 2 verse 10 that the writer says the founder of our salvation was made perfect through suffering. How was he perfected? Is the writer talking in terms of moral perfection? Not in this phrase. He is thinking, when he talks about the Son being made perfect through suffering, being made perfect forever, he's not talking about moral perfection. He is thinking in terms of suitability and ability to perform the intended task. The Son was made perfect through suffering. Because he suffered, by virtue of his suffering, he has become able to carry out his great purpose for us. He is able to be our all-sufficient high priest, as the only one who could stand in the place of sinners, as the only one who did stand in the place of sinners, offering up himself. He is able to bring sinners to God and to bring God to sinners. So, if we could sum up this section, we can see that the great high priest that we need had to be one who was both perfect and perfected. He had to be morally pure and sinless, and so have a right to enter into heaven itself. That was his perfection. But that was only half of it. That in and of itself was not enough. Not only had he to be perfect, but he had to be perfected. He had to be qualified by suffering if he was to enter heaven on our behalf. You see, if Jesus had lived a spotless, sinless life on earth, and then ascended to heaven without dying and rising again, he would have entered heaven alone. Without dying, he would never have been able to fulfill his role as great high priest. There was only one way for Jesus to be the high priest that his people need. He must offer himself in our place. There is absolutely no way that sinners can stand in God's presence except on the basis of blood atonement. There's absolutely no way for a high priest, even a sinless high priest, to bring his people to God except through the shedding of his own blood. It's remarkable. It's astounding how easily we can let the words "the death of Jesus" become nothing more than an evangelical cliche. Yes, the death of Jesus, it's what we confess. But so often the words just roll off our tongues without the slightest thought, without realizing what we are saying. The depths of that statement that Jesus Christ should die for his people, to secure redemption for his people. The thought is beyond our comprehension. His blood, his death was the ransom price to be paid for our deliverance, for our redemption. This one who is holy, innocent, undefiled, separated from sinners, the only one who had the right to enter heaven without tasting death. He said, "Let me take the wrath deserving to this sinner. Let me carry their sorrows. Let me endure the guilt of sin. Let me bear the miseries of this life. Let me carry and bear the infinite pains of hell." Aaron, the sinner, he could only take that lamb in his hands and slay it and say, "It should be me." Jesus Christ came as the lamb, and he said, "Let it be me." But because he has offered himself, the just for the unjust, he is qualified to bring us to God. Jesus won't enter heaven alone. He is there now, but his people, he bears them along with him. As the body goes wherever the head goes, so the people of God go wherever Christ goes. As the writer says in chapter 2, verse 13 of Hebrews, Jesus declares, by virtue of his own death, "Behold, I and the children whom God has given me." Dear believer, guard your heart from becoming blasé, from becoming unmoved by the thought of the death of Jesus Christ. I want us to finish by considering 3 ways that we can do that. 3 ways that we can guard our hearts from becoming unmoved by the death of Christ. And it's 3 remembers. Remember, first of all, that here is all your hope. Here in the death of Christ is all your hope, both in this life and for all eternity. I'm not sure if you've ever come across the Heidelberg Catechism. It's the continental Reformed equivalent to our shorter catechism. Its opening question and answer is so profound. The question is, what is your only comfort in life and death? And the first half of the answer says that I am not my own, but belong with body and soul, both in life and in death, to my faithful Saviour, Jesus Christ. He has fully paid for all my sins with his precious blood and has set me free from all the power of the devil. Brothers and sisters, if it had not been for the humiliation and suffering of Christ, which was his from the womb to the tomb, then you would still be under the guilt of sin and the power of the devil. If it had not been for the death of Jesus, you would at this moment be without hope and be without God in the world. Your hope is found in a perfect high priest who has been perfected through suffering. Remember, secondly, that in the death of Christ, here is love in full bloom. Here in the death of Christ is the full blossom and the full bloom of that love which was set upon you from all eternity. God has loved his people from eternity. There never was a time, dear believer, when God did not love you. But how do you know that he has loved you? John says in 1 John 4:10, "In this is love, not that we have loved God, but that he loved us and sent his Son to be the propitiation for our sins." John 3:16, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son." 1 John 3:16, "By this we know love, that he laid down his life for us." Here in the death of Christ is that love displayed for all to see. We can so easily forget the love of God shown to us in the cross work of Christ. We can so easily be distracted by the pressures and the trials of life, and we can become like those to whom Malachi prophesied, who dared to ask the question of God, "How have you loved us? Where is the evidence of your love? Look at my life. It's a disaster zone. If I'm not coming out of a trial, it's because I'm walking straight into one. Are you sure, Lord, that you love me?" All God has to do is point to Calvary. There. Is that not proof enough that I love you? Have I not displayed my love to you in the deepest crimson dye on that cross? The love which God has set upon us, the love which he has set upon you, dear believer, even before he created the world, it has come to full and perfect blossom in the once for all offering up of his Son as our great high priest. And finally, remember, in the death of Christ, here is the oath fulfilled. Here's the fulfillment of that oath which God gave, so that, as the writer said previously, we might have strong encouragement to hold fast to the hope set before us. God gave his oath. He swore by himself that his Son would be a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. The oath was sworn to the Son, but the word of the oath has been given to us, his people. The word of the oath was to cause his people to hold fast to the hope that was set before them. But remember that oath was given in Psalm 110. It was given before Christ came. Now, if the giving of that oath was intended to give strong encouragement to the people of God to hold fast to what God had promised them, then how much more the fulfillment of the oath in the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ? Dear believer, how much more encouragement the death of Christ, our high priest, gives us. How much more encouragement it gives to us who have believed this gospel. As we see Christ crucified, as we see him dead and buried as our great high priest, as we see him raised again from the grave and exalted higher than the heavens, as we see the word of God's oath fulfilled in all that Christ has done, how much more encouragement it gives to us to hold on, hold fast to the hope set before us. As Paul says in Romans 8:32, "He who did not spare his own Son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not with him graciously give us all things?" Dear believer, as you struggle through life with its very real trials, its very real tribulations, you might wonder, will I ever make it through? You might wonder, will God be true to his word? Well, here's your proof. Here in the death of Christ is the bedrock for your faith. God has established the word of his promise in the death of his Son, our great high priest. If you're an unbeliever here this morning, you must realize two things from this passage. You need a priest, a great high priest who can deal with your guilt, who can deal with your misery that is due to your sin. But not only do you need such a priest, only one such priest has been provided. There's no hope anywhere else. If you reject this high priest, then you reject the only way that God has provided for you to be reconciled with him. I leave you with the words of the Apostle Peter. There is salvation in no one else, for there is no other name under heaven given among men by which we must be saved. Amen. Let's stand together as we come to God in prayer.